In this video, we're going to be looking at what we call biogeochemical cycles. Over the next process, we're actually going to be looking at 3 of those different cycles. So before we get kind of too scared of this word, let's break this down. We're going to remind you that bio actually means life or living. Geo is like geography, so it's like Earth. And then chemicals, that's like chemistry. That's what we studied Unit 1. So biogeochemical cycles are actually just the recycling of different chemicals throughout Earth. The particles that make up matter cannot be created or destroyed. So that means that if you don't recycle these nutrients, we're going to run out. You can't create new nitrogen, you can't create new carbon. So we actually have to recycle these nutrients throughout the environment to make sure that we have enough to sustain ourselves. So what we're going to be looking in this video is going to be the carbon cycle. And then in another video, we're going to look at the nitrogen cycle. And you're going to be responsible for reading about the water cycle yourself. So the carbon cycle is actually looking at 2 different processes, cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So let's go ahead and start with the carbon cycle. We're going to be looking at 2 different things. These are going to be really important again in grade 10. And if you take grade 12 bio, you're going to look at them again. So most of the Earth's carbon is actually cycled between the 2 processes, cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So cellular respiration is actually completed by humans. So I put little lungs here. I want you to think about your lungs when you're thinking about this process because it's actually the process of breathing. So humans are going to use oxygen and sugar to produce the waste products, carbon dioxide, and energy. So if you look here, we can actually see the equation for cellular respiration. So we have oxygen here. This here is called glucose, it's sugar. So my 2 reactants, my 2 ingredients in this is oxygen and sugar. So this is food and oxygen. You can take these 2 things and you can combine them and you're gonna make the waste products carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So essentially, you expel these waste products by breathing out. When you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide. You're also breathing out a little bit of water, and then you can actually use this energy to do things. So this is why you need to eat food. You eat food in order to go through cellular respiration to create the energy that your body needs to walk around, but also more importantly, the energy your body needs to make your heart beat, to think, to do all the things that you do that are living. Photosynthesis is done with plants. So we've got this little green leaf here. So plants are going to use carbon dioxide and water. So we need to water plants. Plants, rather than breathing in oxygen, they actually breathe in carbon dioxide. They also take energy. This energy is coming from the sun. So plants are able to use the energy from the sun, the water that we provide them, the carbon dioxide, and they're able to produce sugar. So this sugar can be used as food. And oxygen, this is the oxygen that we breathe. So if you take a look, we actually call these processes reciprocal. What it means is they're actually opposite of each other. These 2 things go into this reaction. These 2 things go out of this reaction. So we go in and then we go out. So the waste products of this are actually entered into this reaction here. My waste products here, carbon dioxide and water, are actually what leads in to this reaction here. So it's like a circle, it's like a cycle, it's a reciprocal process. So you need to be able to recognize these equations. So I could show you an equation and I could ask you, is it cellular respiration or is it photosynthesis? So we have the word equation over here. These are the chemical equations. So our word equation for cellular respiration, we have oxygen plus glucose just means sugar, is going to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The word equation for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy, remember that energy is coming from the sun, will yield or form oxygen and glucose or sugar. A little bit more about the carbon cycle. So not all carbon is stuck between cellular respiration or photosynthesis. Some is actually stored. So we actually call that carbon reservoirs. So there's 2 different terms that I want you to know, carbon sink and carbon source. A carbon sink is anything that absorbs more carbon than it releases. So it's like a carbon storage area. A carbon source is anything that releases more carbon than it absorbs. So you can actually see in this diagram a bunch of different carbon sinks and carbon sources. So burning fossil fuels the leaving of fossil fuels, that's considered to be a carbon source. So when we burn fossil fuels, we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. We're a source of carbon. If we want to store carbon, we can store carbon as oil, coal, or limestone. So these are considered to be the lithosphere carbon stores. You also have a biosphere carbon store that has to do with organic matter. So every time that we cut down trees, deforestation, we add carbon to the atmosphere. Anytime that we actually plant trees or you have any sort of organic material, living or dead, that's a carbon source or a carbon sink that's actually holding that carbon within that tree. So there's a bunch of carbon stored within these trees. There's a bunch of carbon stored within you. It's not being released, so it's considered to be a carbon sink. We have a hydrosphere carbon store. So in the hydrosphere carbon store, you have marine deposits. So things like shells, sand, they're all acting as carbon sinks. Dissolved carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide can be released into the water. That's an example of a carbon source in the hydrosphere. And finally, we have an atmospheric carbon store. So in the atmospheric carbon store, you essentially see diffusion. So if carbon dioxide is being given off, it's a carbon source. If carbon dioxide is actually being absorbed into the atmosphere, then it's considered to be a carbon sink. When we're looking at carbon storage, there's two different types of carbon storage: inorganic and organic carbon storage. Inorganic is anything that's really kind of not living. So you can store carbon as a gas, oftentimes carbon dioxide. You can store carbon as a liquid. That's as dissolved carbon dioxide. You typically see that in the hydrosphere. And you can also store carbon as a solid. An example of solid carbon is like carbonate or limestone. You also have organic carbon stores. So your organic carbon stores are organisms. So you, a tree, your dog, you are all examples of organisms that are storing carbon. That means that you actually have to be added back to the carbon cycle. So when you die, decomposers are going to come, they're going to break you down, and whatever carbon is stored within you as a human being is going to be returned back to the soil so it can go into the carbon cycle. Sometimes it's not returned back to the soil. Sometimes it's concentrated. That's an example of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are dead organic carbon storage areas where it's an animal that's died and it's been turned into a fossil fuel over many, many, many years. This is an example of the carbon cycle in terms of a diagram. So for these nutrient cycles, you're going to see these diagrams, and it just shows the cycling of carbon throughout the area. So it can be a little confusing at first because carbon's moving through the atmosphere in many different ways. So we have photosynthesis is actually taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When this tree is broken down, it's going to decompose this tree into the soil. That decomposition is going to then lead to fossil fuels. Animal respiration, so you have your animal here. Animals will also decompose and they'll get added back to the soil, which will turn into fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels can then be released if we burn those fossil fuels, fossil fuel combustion. So they're then released to the atmosphere. So we're going to see carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Other things that add to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere: animal respiration. So remember, carbon dioxide is given off when we go through cellular respiration, or also plant respiration. Plants can also undergo cellular respiration. So they're going to release carbon dioxide that's going to get added to the atmosphere. So this carbon is constantly cycling around, and this is what we actually call the carbon cycle.